Alright guys, welcome back to Unit 14, the Civil War, the American Iliad. Just to review, we've already covered Part 1, the Civil War Awakening, already covered Part 2, the war intensifies, we covered Part 3 last time with the turning of the tide. This is going to be Part 4 then, the Union grinds down the Confederacy 1864 to 1865. What we're going to cover in this Part 4 is kind of the overall strategy by the Union to ultimately win the war beginning in 1864. We'll talk briefly about what the overall strategy was, then get into the particular campaigns that end up winning the war, such as the Overland Campaign and Sherman's invasion of the Deep South. Then we'll finish out with how the war came to a conclusion by having a discussion about the Appomattox campaign. But let's briefly talk about what the overall strategy beginning in 1864 was to win the war. Now, so far you've gotten the idea that Lincoln has gone through a lot of generals. We had Irvin McDowell to begin with; he was fired. We get George B. McClellan; he was fired. We get a guy named Ambrose Burnside. We didn't talk about him, but he's a commander. He's fired. We get another guy named Joseph Hooker. We never talk about him either, but he was a commander and he got fired. Then there was George Meade at Gettysburg, but even he was demoted. But finally we have Ulysses S. Grant. So just, Lincoln had never found a general that understood the situation the same way Lincoln did. Lincoln had always wanted his generals to attack the Confederate Army regardless of a victory or a defeat in battle. And in April of 1864, Lincoln finally has that commander in Ulysses S. Grant that understands the situation. And so beginning in 1864, Lincoln and Grant came up with a plan to ultimately win the war. And the way they came up with this plan is they asked themselves, how is it that the Union is still fighting this war when the Union was so heavily favored in manpower and resources? And what they decided was that the Union up to this point had not put enough pressure on the Confederacy on all fronts of the war at the same time. Rather, what the war had been characterized by this point was uncoordinated attacks at certain spots of the Confederacy, and that had been a losing strategy so far because this had allowed Robert E. Lee to shift Confederate forces around the theaters of the war wherever they were needed most. So what Lincoln and Grant come up with was a plan to deprive Lee of this ability. So ultimately what they decided on was that on a certain day, every single Union army across all of the battlefronts, across all the theaters of the war, would attack the Confederate border all at once. And win or lose, they would continue the assault. This would prevent Lee from shifting forces around in order to stop uncoordinated attacks. And in some places, Lee may be successful in stopping the Union assault, but he wouldn't be able to stop it everywhere. Now, Abraham Lincoln he said of this strategy that I just described that it reminded him of his hog killing days back in Illinois when he was a kid. He said that everybody had a job when it came to hog killing, and even if you weren't killing the hog, or even if you weren't skinning the hog, you could at least hold one of the legs. And that's kind of what's going on here, is that Grant and Lincoln are coming up with a strategy to grind down the Confederacy by attacking on every single front, and win or lose in those engagements, the Union armies will continue to attack. And now he has a commander in Ulysses S. Grant that finally understands the situation. So here's a great picture of Ulysses S. Grant that's been touched up modern day to color, but I think it's really good because every photo we've seen of him so far has just been in black and white. So he now has Grant. In early May 1864, Grant will send out orders to every single Union army to move against the Confederacy on all fronts. The main thrust of the Union assault is going to come in northern Virginia, moving south to engage Robert E. Lee's army. But another main thrust of the Union army will be made out of Tennessee into Georgia, trying to destroy the Western Confederate armies. What we want to do is take both of those main thrusts, Grant's thrust through northern Virginia, and then talk about the one made in the west into the heartland of the Confederacy, of course, Sherman's invasion of the Deep South. Let's focus on Grant first. Grant's assault on the Confederacy became known as the Overland Campaign. And the reason it was called this is because that harkens back to the Peninsula Campaign of George B. McClellan. You remember McClellan wanted to assault the Confederacy by landing forces amphibiously. Grant's not going to do that. What you have taking place here in Northern Virginia is the ultimate showdown of American military commanders, pitting Ulysses S. Grant for the Union against Robert E. Lee for the Confederacy. Winner take all. Just a cage match is going to be fought here in Northern Virginia as part of Grant's Overland Campaign. Here's the campaign, Grant's strategy to win the war. He is going to begin moving the largest Union army south from Washington, D.C. The ultimate goal is to capture the Confederate capital of Richmond and to destroy Lee's army along the way. And regardless of the battles that Grant will fight here during the Overland Campaign, whether he wins them, whether he loses them, he will continue to push south. And it will force then Robert E. Lee to continuously engage Grant's army. And that's exactly what Grant wants. Now these are some of the major battles of the Overland Campaign, and you don't need to know them, but I want you to see what's going on here. This is how the numbers game plays out. Every single one of these battles are a defeat for Grant and the Union, and you can see how many casualties they will lose in each of these three major battles of the Overland Campaign. In many cases, especially that last one, this was a major defeat for the Union. But what matters are the casualties that the Confederacy takes. See, all those casualties the Union is suffering, they can be easily replaced and quickly. But the Confederacy simply doesn't have enough men to be able to lose this many casualties in each of these battles. And that's how it's a numbers game. If you have enough of these battles, you will grind down Lee's army to nothing. Now, we'll see by the end of this by the end of this lecture, that's exactly what's going to happen. So it's all about the numbers game. And beginning in May of 1864, Grant's army will begin moving south. The ultimate goal is to grind down Lee's army and capture the Confederate capital of Richmond, thereby ending the war. Now, by the summer of 1864, Grant very quickly is at the gates of the Confederate capital of Richmond. The problem is that the Confederates have been preparing for this, and they have dug in really deep in and around Richmond and a town south of it called Petersburg. The Union, therefore, will spend almost an entire year trying to turn the flank of the Confederate lines south of the city of Petersburg. And this is going to go on for nearly a year. For nearly a year, both sides are just going to lay siege warfare towards one another. The Union repeatedly trying to either break the lines of the Confederacy, which is going to be damn near impossible, or at the very least, you can see way down there at the bottom end of that map, turn the flank of the Confederate lines. And if you can do that, the Confederacy will have to choose with either being surrounded and ultimately captured inside Richmond, or they'll have to flee the area. So the point here is that by the fall of 1864, this siege warfare has been going on in and around Richmond, and it will last almost a year. So this was the Overland Campaign. This was the main thrust of the general strategy to win the war. Here's a picture of some of the Confederate earthworks. I mean, you can see how formidable Petersburg and Richmond were. This was not going to be a city that the Union Army was going to be able to just stroll right into. Think of Vicksburg, but on a much larger scale. So the goal here for the Union is going to be then to turn the flanks of the Confederate Army, force them into retreating, or force them into being surrounded. Now, while this siege of Richmond and Petersburg is taking place, the other main thrust of the Union strategy is taking place in Georgia, and that's where I want to turn to next. What I'm really talking about here is what is known as Sherman's invasion of the Deep South. Now, Sherman, who is this guy? Sherman is William Tecumseh Sherman. Sherman was one of the most trusted subordinate generals to Ulysses S. Grant. Sherman understood everything Grant understood. He understood what it would take to win the war. He understood that win or lose a battle, you gotta keep pushing. Sherman is in charge of the Union armies in the West. And when Grant goes back to Virginia to take over command of the armies in Virginia, he leaves Sherman in charge. Now, Sherman's part in all of this strategy is to invade the Deep South. And that's exactly what he begins to do. It will take him nearly a year, but he will slug it out through the mountains of northern Georgia. Repeatedly, he'll be defeated in small battles, but he doesn't care. He keeps pushing further and further and further. The ultimate goal for him is to capture the city of Atlanta. This was the second largest city in the Confederacy, and it was a major producer of firearms and iron and railroad equipment and all the stuff the South is using to make war. Atlanta was a big prize. Now, it took a very, very long time for Sherman to move just from Chattanooga to capture the city of Atlanta. But he will capture the city of Atlanta just around September of 1864. The city of Atlanta was burned by the Confederates as they retreated, so Sherman will get nothing of gain here. But the city of Atlanta will fall to William T. Sherman in the West. Now, there is actually a reason I'm telling you about the fall of Atlanta. In terms of military strategy, it was a big success, but there was also a political effect of the fall of Atlanta. Let me explain. In 1863, we discussed how the turning of the tide against the Confederacy occurred, but the war is now a year removed from all that, and it shows little signs of ending. And many Northerners were not happy about this. In fact, they were very upset with Abraham Lincoln, and the president himself believed that because of this anger by the Northern people, that he would not win re-election in 1864. And again, the reason for all this is that Americans in the North just believed we thought the war was almost over after Gettysburg, Vicksburg, and Chattanooga, but here we are almost a year later, and it's still going. So morale in the North is dipping very badly, and Lincoln was convinced that he was not going to win re-election. But Atlanta changed all that. Atlanta came at a time when Americans were about to go to the polls in the North in November of 1864, and they responded by the Union capture of Atlanta by voting Abraham Lincoln right back to office. And that in itself is kind of significant because it means the war will continue. Okay, after the fall of Atlanta, Sherman decided that rather than rely on supply lines coming from the north, that he would embark on what became known as the March to the Sea, in which he would march his about 100,000-man army from Atlanta to the coast of Georgia, relying on the land and taking what his army needed from the Confederate sympathizers along the way. Now, depending on who you are today, this is either a famous march to the sea or an infamous march to the sea, because what Sherman's troops did here was they brought what was known as the heavy hand of war to the Confederacy. Sherman wanted the Confederates to feel this war. He argued that they had really not felt the ravages of war, and that he was in a position now to make them feel it. Now, he didn't go out and just murder and massacre thousands of Confederate civilians, but what he did do was anything that the Confederacy was using to support the war effort, he destroyed it. And oftentimes this resulted in near destructions of entire cities along the way. Here's a picture of one of the cities along his march to the sea. You can see it's completely bombed out, completely burnt out. He would have also been ripping up railroad tracks all along the way. One of the favorite things his soldiers would do is take rail lines, heat them up over fire, and then wrap them around trees so they could never be used again. This tactic became known as Sherman's bow ties. As you would have seen these all along the route from Atlanta to the sea in which Sherman's army was marching. And so you can see here just the utter devastation that Sherman's army is bringing forth upon the heart of the Confederacy. This was a very demoralizing moment for the Confederacy, largely because there was no Confederate army here to stop this from happening. There was really nothing opposing Sherman's army except for local militia, which are just old men and boys, no professional soldiers or anything like that. This was absolutely demoralizing to the Confederacy. Just on an interesting side note, if anyone's familiar with the song by the Charlie Daniels, that the Devil Went Down to Georgia, that song is based loosely on Sherman's March to the Sea. Still today, people in Georgia do not look upon William T. Sherman with much gratitude. In fact, he is considered in many parts of the South to be the devil because of what he did along the march to the sea. Now, I want to be clear that he was well within the rules of engagement for 19th century warfare. This was nothing new, but for the Confederacy, this was something new in terms of feeling the war, the heavy hand or the hard hand of war, of which Sherman definitely made them feel, and that was certainly his intention. After arriving at the coast in Savannah, he will be resupplied by the Union Navy, and he's not done there. From there, completely unopposed, he will take his 100,000-man army into the heart of the Confederacy, where it all began. He'll invade South Carolina. He will capture the capital of South Carolina, Columbia. He will burn it to the ground. From there, he will then move into the Carolinas. Along the way, doing the same things that he was doing in Georgia and in South Carolina. By the spring of 1865, he will be in North Carolina, at Bentonville in North Carolina. His army will defeat a very large Confederate army, and again, it's all just very, very demoralizing for the Confederacy. It is a sign that it is all over. Now, here's the thing. Sherman's actions out here in the West were very demoralizing, but if Robert E. Lee's army survives, everyone agreed the Confederate cause is still alive. So all eyes turned to what was taking place in and around Richmond and Petersburg. If the war was going to be lost by the Confederacy, that's where it was going to have to occur. Lee's army was the lightning rod. Destroy it, and you win the war. And that was the purpose of the Overland Campaign. So I want to now talk about how the war came to an end, kind of the end result of the Overland Campaign. In early April 1865, the Union finally turns the Confederate flanks south of Petersburg. It's at this point that the Confederate government and Lee's army has a decision. If they remain where they are, they will be encircled and they will be wiped out, or they can flee to the west. Lee decided to continue the war by fleeing to the west. His ultimate goal was to link up with remnants of the Confederate Western armies in Lynchburg, Virginia. And you can see on this map, this became known as the Appomattox Campaign. And as Lee's army moved west, he is relentlessly pursued by Grant and the Union Army. A bunch of small-scale battles will take place as Lee's army moves west. Every single one of these battles, Lee will be losing more and more soldiers, either killed, wounded, or in most cases captured. And so as Lee was moving west, his army is dwindling even more. Lee's army is now in shambles, and what is left of his army becomes trapped and surrounded by Grant and the Union Army near a small town in Virginia known as Appomattox Courthouse. Now, it's not Appomattox, it's Appomattox Courthouse. Here is a widescreen shot of the town. It's a very small town. The building right in the middle is the courthouse, but the town is called Appomattox Courthouse. It was around this city that Lee realized something. On April 9th, 1865, Lee realized that his army is gone. In fact, he only had about 30,000 men left. And it was on that day, on April 9th, 1865, that Lee decided that he needed to surrender to Ulysses S. Grant and the Union Army. Here is a painting depicting the ceremony in which Lee was signing the surrender of his army. That scene took place in this house right here. This is known as the Wilbur McLean House. This is what it looked like at Appomattox in 1865. It still stands today. This is what it looks like today. Here's a picture of that same painting, just in real life. Now, the tables there are not the original tables and chairs. Those are reproductions. If you want to see the original tables and chairs, You can go to our nation's capital in Washington, D.C., and you can see the original chair and table at which this surrender ceremony took place. April 9th, 1865. Now, an interesting thing here, Lee's army was not the only army left for the Confederacy, but everyone agreed that Lee's surrender at Appomattox was the practical end to the war. By May of 1865, all the other Confederate armies will have surrendered, and this war is now over. Okay, so this concludes Part 4 of Unit 14. In Part 5, we'll discuss the cost and the ultimate significance of the American Civil War.